Yeah, we ain't surviving this one, boys. There is one specific task that the military trains for that is harder and deadlier than anything else. And it's not a beach landing, it's not an airborne jump. In fact, most people outside the military have never even heard about it. Today, I'm going to get you spun up on America's deadliest mission, the Combined Arms Breach. Also, isn't this cool? I learned a new editing trick. Anyway, dive violently the like and subscribe button and let's talk about it. A combined arms breach is one of the biggest and most complicated mission sets in the military. In a nutshell, it's when a large mechanized group breaks through the prepared defenses of another large mechanized group, so both sides have a lot of tanks and armor and stuff like that. And those defenses include mines, barbed wire, tank traps, trenches, dug-in tank fighting positions, artillery, and aircraft. On the other side, you have an equally armed and armored lineup of dudes who probably just really want to go home at this point after they found out they were doing a combined arms breach. These operations are the heavyweight boxing matches of the military, basically two very well-armed, heavily armored forces duking it out. There's no sneaking around, no high-speed special forces guys knifing people in the throat. It's loud, it's huge, and it's really, really fucking dangerous. To put this into perspective, whenever the military has performed one of these, it ends up being called the Battle of Insert Location and gets a dedicated Wikipedia page. They are messy, they're chaotic, and even the manual on how to perform them says that they are the hardest mission to accomplish, so I'm not just making this up for clickbait purposes. Now, part of that is because they're done at a very high level. Typically, an entire brigade of nearly 5,000 ground troops, pilots, and support personnel are required. That leads to a lot of things potentially going wrong, and when a single portion of this plan does inevitably go wrong, casualties start to mount, and they mount fast. If one tank goes down at the exact wrong spot or a helicopter missile misses a high-value target, the entire operation is at risk. So with all that said, let's get into what this looks like on the ground. The scenario the Army trains for is an enemy armor battalion, in this case the bastard Denovians, defending a massive defensive lineup made of every kind of mine you can think of. Tank ditches, wire obstacles, and, well, basically anything that would make crossing it hard short of laying down mousetraps and thumbtacks. They have tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, anti-tank infantry, stuff to shoot down planes and helicopters, and all the other supporting elements they'd need. They're dug in, they know we're coming, and by golly, they are willing to die for their country if it means not giving the Americans an inch. Denovians are trained from a very young age to see dying for their country as one of the highest honors one can achieve. On the good guys' side, you have an American Armor Brigade combat team. These are massive units centered around hundreds of Abrams tanks and Bradley IFVs, aka the only two things I use when I play Battlefield 6. Supporting them are the engineers that will be charged with blowing a hole in the defenses, literally, artillery to keep the Denovians' heads down, and helicopters and strike aircraft to take out high-priority targets like enemy missile batteries. 3 battalions of tanks and infantry make up the primary fighting force. The first 2 will each conduct their own breaches into the defense, and whichever one succeeds, and if you read between the lines on that means whichever one doesn't die, secures the hole while the 3rd battalion pushes through it. Sounds simple enough, so what does that actually entail? Well, first we need to take a little detour.
On a slightly unrelated note, I told myself that when I got out of the Army, I would never eat another MRE even if someone paid me to. And then someone paid me to. But a part of the reason I hated them so much is that heating them up was super annoying. It took way too long, and I got better results using a motel microwave when it came to actually fully heating up food. But see, I probably wouldn't have hated eating them so much if I had something like this, the MRE oven. See, one of the reasons that heating up an MRE is a butthole experience is because you're supposed to do it in these little cardboard sleeves, which, as you know, cardboard is fantastic for even and rapid heat distribution while being very structurally stable. Ah, gotcha, that was a trick. The MRE oven, however, is all of those things. It traps the heat and actually secures the food so it's not half spilling out the top. It also has room to fit more than one meal item in there, so now you can actually have that hot meal, not a somewhat warm entree and a cold everything else. These guys also offer a way better hot beverage bag that is actually useful as a beverage bag because the government issue one is literally just a Ziploc baggie that you're supposed to drink out of. and they might as well just include a note to go fuck yourself with that one. And finally, the big thing for me is that this is super lightweight. When you're out in the field, the last thing you want is more heavy stuff to carry around. And I would much rather have this in my ruck than trying to fit in a jet boil. So go check out everything you see here at mreoven.com and grab yourself a nice little piece of kit that makes living outside in the cold a little more enjoyable. Thank you to MRE Oven for sponsoring the channel, and now back to the video.
I was kind of mad they didn't send me a Chili Mac one for the ad. Anyway, so combined arms breach, what does it actually look like? Well, it comes down to a little acronym called SOSRA. SOSRA stands for Suppress, Obscure, Secure, Reduce, and Assault. This is the tactic used for any obstacle breach, from a squad cutting a single strand of razor wire to entire brigades duking it out. Step 1. Suppress the enemy. And quick note, despite the fact that the footage I pulled for this is shown during the daytime, odds are this would happen at night to make it easier for us to not be so obvious a target. Long-range munitions like HIMARS or MLRS platforms hit targets deep behind the enemy lines. This would include enemy rockets and missiles, command nodes, or supplies. Simultaneously, the Americans conduct seed operations or suppression of enemy air defenses, so using things like anti-radiation missiles to target things that would shoot down our drones or helicopters. After that, cannon artillery, in this case paladins, start to put rounds down range, first targeting enemy artillery and then other high payoff targets like tanks and IFVs. It's worth noting here that the second we fire the first shot, it is game on. So while I'm describing all the following steps, American tanks are blowing up, helicopters shot down, and generic unnamed infantry privates catching rounds to the face. This footage is all from official Army publications, so they're not going to be showing it like that because this is how it's supposed to go, not how it actually goes. In this phase, they are setting the conditions, to borrow a military phrase, and it's a bit of a tightrope to balance. Sure, you could sit there all day pounding away with rockets and artillery, but that gives the enemy plenty of time to start bringing in reinforcements or start blowing up the entire brigade of tanks you have just kind of sitting around in the open. But if you don't suppress enough, well, then you get Omaha Beach Landing 2.0. The key to this is speed and operational inertia. If you lose either of those, you lose momentum, and then your stuff starts getting blown up. And that's partially what makes this so difficult. All the hundreds of cogs in the machine have to be working perfectly. So when things like your radio's going down or a tank gets stuck in a ditch, which they will, both of those, it causes a snowball effect and fast. Now, when we say an enemy force is, quote, suppressed, we don't mean it as just a generic term that means they're hiding behind cover yelling into their radios that they're pinned down. See, there's 3 states that the artillery will put on some bad guys: suppressed, neutralized, and destroyed. Suppressed means they temporarily can't fight. Neutralized means they are still there but can't really fight because certain things got blown up. And destroyed means, well, destroyed. And in order for that unit to be combat capable again, they would need replacements of stuff and people. While it would be nice to just blow everyone up with artillery and airstrikes before the fight even starts, it is not feasible. There are just too many targets, and they have too much armor, and they're dug in. We would need to be firing World War I levels of artillery in order to achieve even a neutralization of the the Denovians. And that assumes they just sit there indefinitely waiting to die, which they probably wouldn't. Those definitions of suppressed and destroyed and all that depend on what kind of force you're fighting. So in this case, it would mean that enemy units would need to reposition to different fighting positions if they wanted to engage us. Or if they were to move into a fighting position, they would get hammered, and so they can't. And that's the window we use for step 2, obscure. Obscure here isn't a reference to my fleeting reasons to continue living. Here it just means smoke, and lots of smoke. This is mostly going to be coming from the artillery guys. And while yes, each individual armored vehicle is going to have smoke canisters, those are for self-protection, like getting locked on by an Apache on the new shitty Battlefield map. And where that smoke hits is very important. You might not want it exactly on the obstacle belt because then the guys breaching it can't see anything, and commanders in the rear have no idea what's going on. You also don't want it directly on top of the enemy force because you could miss and have it land behind them, making it completely useless, or if the wind changes directions on you, it would rapidly clear up their sight picture. The best place is ideally right in front of the enemy line, between them and the obstacle if possible. That gives you the maximum distance that your side can see and buys you some extra time as the smoke dissipates or wind blows it away that it'll still keep you covered. Also, that was a joke earlier, by the way, about having obscure reasons to live. Mine are actually very clear. It's just one, and it's literally just my cat Miso. Now, here's the part of the video where I need to highlight two very, 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 very important vehicles. The JABS, or Joint Assault Bridge System, and the ABV, or Assault Breaching Vehicle. These vehicles belong to the engineers, and it's their job to clear a path for the rest of the brigade. The ABV's job is to clear mines and obstacles, using both the plow up front to push them out of the way, and the dual Miklik launcher in the back to blow them up. The Miklik, in a nutshell, is a rope with C4 in it. That gets shot out with a rocket, lands across a minefield, and goes kablooey. One shot from these can, on paper at least, create an 8 by 120 meter space for tanks to roll through, basically one at a time, one in front of the other. And for this scenario, we're going to assume that the charges fly straight, which they don't, land where they need to, which they don't, and detonate all the mines in the way, including the ones designed specifically to not get blown up by Miklik charges, which they don't. To say that these guys have a dangerous job is the understatement of the century. If you're wondering why the military hasn't performed an execution in a while, it's because we just take the guys on death row and stick them in the ABV and let the enemy do it for us. We also only have 6 in an entire brigade. Split between 2 breach points means you have the entire success and failing of the whole operation relying on a set of 3 very easily identifiable vehicles each. And it ain't no secret to the other side that if these vehicles fail or get blown up, this whole operation is a bust. The Army says that if these vehicles are destroyed, it, quote, drastically complicates the breach, which is a sanitized way of saying fucks up literally everything. You best believe the bad guys holding the ground are going to do everything within their power to turn those vehicles into scrap metal. So how do we keep that from happening? Step 3 of SOSRA, secure. This phase begins when the engineer elements are 200 meters away from their deployment point. At each of the 2 breach points, combined arms companies, or even battalions if necessary, of tanks and IFVs establish what's called a local support by fire. Support by fire is a task where you are essentially providing covering fire from a relatively stationary position for a maneuver element. At a grand scale, there would be some overarching unit providing it across the brigade at each breach. However, an additional support by fire position is established closer in order to provide more effective and more accurate fire, while also being positioned for the next step. The tanks and infantry in the local support by fire at this point are going, or at least should be going, absolutely batshit crazy firing, blasting at anything and everything that looks vaguely non-American. Once that happens, tanks equipped with mine rollers push up and either find the edge of the minefield visually or more likely blow one up. At that point, they pop smoke, and the tank commander screams to his driver something to the effect of, "Holy fucking shit, oh my god, driver back." And this brings us to step 4 of SOSRA, reduce, a single word phrase which here means destroying and or getting rid of the obstacles, mines, and other nasties between you and your objective. That first smoke pop is the trigger for the ABV to move forward to the lead tank, or at least whatever's left of it at that point. When you're the lone tank with a very obvious breaching attachment to the front of your vehicle, way ahead of everyone else, you become target numero uno. Once the ABV moves up, the Miklik gets launched and theoretically clears a path. Damn, look at those graphics, it feels like I'm really there. Of course, as mentioned before, modern anti-tank mines are designed to not get blown up sympathetically, meaning another explosion isn't going to blow them up like this. So now they have to conduct what's known as proofing the lane. Anytime any obstacle is reduced, you always proof the lane. Lane here being the spot that good guys will move through. That means the engineers move in and make sure that all the mines are actually gone and the main force can actually push through. The last thing you want is the spearhead of your assaulting element to get blown up in the breach, and now you have flaming tank holes blocking the one opening in the enemy's defenses. ABVs do this with a mine plow, which digs up and pushes buried mines out of the way. The roller tank, you know, the one from before that's definitely still alive, then follows the ABV, just to double check that nothing was missed. Or at least the backup one does, because in these kinds of operations, one is none, and there are redundancies of equipment down the entire line, because it's expected that a good bit, if not most, are gonna get destroyed. At this point, there is still another obstacle that needs dealing with, a giant linear hole in the ground known as a tank ditch. A tank ditch is exactly what it sounds like. Just like the metaphorical ditch that is my romantic life, a literal tank ditch is both too deep and too steep to get over. And this is where the jabs come in, with the goal of deploying their little bridge for everyone to cross over. It's here that the official army verbiage starts to get a little dark. See, once the lane is proof, the roller tank and ABV have to get out of the way, so they have to drive into the active minefield to make room, while also being stationary at the exact location that probably every single enemy field of fire overlaps. From this point on, official Army doctrine refers referencing all vehicles and equipment, starting with the phrase, "if still operational," because it's a snowflake's chance in hell that they're not flaming wreckage at this point. I do like that they depict the ABV's seemingly unmanned 50 cal machine gun going ham, as if that would actually accomplish anything, except getting the gunner killed. And here's the fun part. Assuming that both the engineer vehicle and the roller tank are still alive somehow, they get to do all that all over again to keep clearing through the second minefield. And this starts to run into the Miklik supply that we have in real life. Those C4 ropes don't like to do what we want them to do, so odds are, in reality, both tubs would be fired just for the first breach. So odds are at this point they would need to be calling in the second one, but for now we'll assume everything is going well, for some reason. If by the skin of your teeth and literal divine intervention this worked so far, the units providing local support by fire push through forward in order to establish far side security of the breach. The only thing worse than everyone dying in the breach is the enemy retaking and securing it, and it's their job to prevent that from happening. Once on the other side of the obstacles, they start laying down some more scunion. Meanwhile, the main assault force, the 3rd Battalion I mentioned earlier, ideally was already moving forward so they can start pushing past it. Once they do pass through, things start to get a little tricky in terms of friendly fire, not accidentally offing our own guys. The breaching forces have to now conduct what's called a rearward passage of lines. In boiled down terms, it's when a unit from behind passes in front of a friendly stationary unit. It sounds simple enough, but this can get super tricky and super dangerous really quickly if everyone isn't on the same page. There are different ways of doing this with differing levels of detailed planning, which I'm not going to get too in-depth into because that's a video all on its own. In this case, however, where speed is the first, second, and third priority, the general rule of thumb is going to be, once the assaulting element gets online with a stationary one, the stationary one calls a ceasefire, and once it's confirmed, then the assaulting element passes through. Once those guns are turned off, the guys that were stationary, securing the hole in the obstacles, push forward 500 meters. But that number is at least according to doctrine, of course. That distance is largely going to be based on the mission at hand that gets them a little farther away from the minefield and some breathing room to fall back if a counterattack starts coming their way. Now, with everyone on the other side, the actual operation can begin. Yes, all of that death, destruction, and poorly rendered blood was just the opening stages of this fight. The infantry sitting in the back of the Brads now dismount, with no optics and bayonets fixed for some reason. And it's their job to start clearing the enemy fighting positions from the flanks, which again I won't get into too much because that's a whole other video. Though I will say you probably shouldn't have your Bradley like 50 meters from the trench line, but let's just take a second to appreciate these brave soldiers with no eye protection, charging and or combat rolling into these trenches. In case you were wondering what this flag is, it's called a Moses pole. And the idea is that good guys know where you are in the trench, so they know where not to shoot. Personally, I think Moses poles are the stupidest things on earth because it quite literally is a giant sign to the enemy that says, "Shoot here." This footage was generated pre-Ukraine if that wasn't the most obvious thing ever. Hell yeah, blind throw a grenade to your right instead of just shooting the guy who's in your field of view who's also apparently blind. This is real warfare. So that's it. The Combined Arms Breach. But here's the thing, that manual hasn't been updated in a hot minute, and military technology has very obviously changed since then. So how would that look differently today? Well, short answer, drones. And the argument can be made that this kind of operation is simply not possible anymore in current conditions. The success of the breach requires that the enemy side is suppressed enough that we can get the jump on them. And that is achieved through artillery, air support, and a shit ton of tanks and IFV cannon fire. And apparently that one guy's grenade. Drones cannot be suppressed in that way, meaning you would need an equally effective counter-UAS plan in order to make that happen, which no one anywhere is close to achieving yet. It seems these days if you use any armored formation larger than a platoon, it generally makes headlines on how fast it was destroyed in the most recent battle. If you thought the ABV wasn't gonna last long in a best case scenario, ain't no way they're lasting now. While they do have extra armor attachments facing towards the direction of fire, they have to keep their top clear for Miklik tubs to fire, so it's just as vulnerable armor-wise. And it's even more vulnerable when you consider it has two giant boxes of C4 explosives on top that make prime targets for FPV drones. So what, are we just stuck on the other side of obstacles forever now? Well, no, because drones, again, are probably the answer to this. US Army engineers have been hell-bent over the last couple of years to get UGVs, specifically for breaching. These would, in short, be small tracked robots filled with explosives or line-clearing charges that don't put humans at risk, and we have more than 3 of them in the entire brigade. Close enough, welcome back Goliath tracked mine. But the reality is that no matter how many drones and superior firepower we have, the numbers are not pretty. Loosely for planning purposes, assuming literally everything goes right, which it won't, it is expected that the brigade will take up to a 30% casualty rate, and that's just getting up to and conducting the breach. While the engineers specifically with their suicide missions are expected to take up to a 50% casualty rate. And those aren't just hypotheticals, the US trains for this mission all the time still, and when you look at historical instances and those done in training, casualty rates usually hover around 40%. It's hard to say if we'll be seeing this mission at that kind of scale ever again, as smaller and more flexible seems to be the way forward. But if we ever have to take on generic bad guy army as presented here, I think we'll do just fine. But on that note, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Please subscribe and I will see you in the next one.